Everyone quieted down so quickly this evening. This is not a Trinity Forum crowd. A good evening to each of you and welcome to tonight's evening conversation on hope, healing, and peacemaking, the role of the faith community in advancing global health. We're delighted that each of you could join us tonight. This is actually the fourth in a five-part series on faith and international development that the Trinity Forum is hosting in partnership with the Gates Foundation and New Venture Fund. So many thanks to those of you who have been with us from the very beginning of this journey. When we started out, we got to hear from Mike Gerson and Steve Bowman speaking about who is our neighbor. We were pleased to be joined with Ambassador Mark Lagon, who's here with us tonight as well, to talk about human dignity and flourishing. Just 2 weeks ago, right next door, we had the privilege of hearing from World Bank President Jim Yong Kim, along with Ambassador Tony Hall, on international poverty alleviation. And we're really excited about our event tonight. So thank you to each of you for coming. Part of our hope for this event is to catalyze conversations on the contributions that faith-based efforts have brought to international development, as well as the challenges and constraints that beset them, and what it means for how we should think about foreign aid and understand what it means to love our neighbors in developing countries. So we're deeply grateful for the Gates Foundation for making this possible, along with New Venture Fund, as well as to each of you for being here tonight. So if this is your first Trinity Forum event, I thought I would just take a moment to say a little bit about who we are, what we'll be doing tonight, as well as who you'll get to be hearing from. For those of you who are new to the Trinity Forum, we exist to provide a space and resources for leaders to grapple with life's biggest questions in the context of faith. And we do this in part not only by publishing quarterly readings that offer the best of literature and letters on the big questions of life, but also by sponsoring programs such as this one tonight to connect leading thinkers with thinking leaders in wrestling with those big questions, and hopefully, ultimately, to coming to better know the author of the answers. And certainly, one of the great questions of life is how we live, how we help our neighbors who are in need, how we care for the least, last, and lost, and how we can live in what the Hebrew language and the Bible refers to as shalom. That is a peace and a flourishing that's brought about by health, by healing, and also by rightly ordered relationships, both with each other and with God. And for many people of faith, advancing global health and missions work has been a primary means of modeling the love and care of He who is known as the Great Physician. Around the world, many millions of people are served primarily, or in sometimes solely, by faith-based mission organizations and healthcare delivery services to minister not only to their physical needs, but also their spiritual ones. But such faith-based efforts at bringing hope, health, and healing to the most vulnerable have inspired not only admiration and inspiration in some quarters, but suspicion in others. The delivery of care to those in dire need is not without its power dynamics, and faith-based medical missions will, by nature, differ, at least at times, from state-run efforts in their motives, methods, and means. And what some have seen as a ministry of healing to body, heart, and soul, others have criticized for being at best limited, or at worst, manipulative. So what are the unique capacities and potential of faith-based global health efforts? And what challenges and constraints accompany them? Is it possible for faith-based efforts to serve the sick in every corner of the world without compromising their mission or disguising their motivation of bringing spiritual as well as physical healing? In short, what is the role of the faith community in advancing global health? These are all big and complex questions to wrestle with, but there are a few that have done so with more thoughtfulness, scholarly insight, or practical wisdom or experience than our speakers here tonight, Dr. Jenny Dyer and Ann Peterson. Jenny Dyer is the executive director of Hope Through Healing Hands, a Nashville-based global health organization chaired by Bill Frist that is committed to improving the quality of life for communities around the world using health as a currency for peace. She directs the Faith-Based Coalition for Healthy Mothers and Children Worldwide and currently teaches global health policy as a lecturer in the Department of Preventative Medicine at Vanderbilt, and also teaches religion and global health as a lecturer at Vanderbilt Divinity School. She previously served as the National Faith Outreach Director for both the Data Foundation and the One Campaign, and has written numerous academic articles on the intersection of religion and health, as well as contributing to the following publications, including Why Save Africa, Answers from Around the World, the Mother and Child Project, Raising Our Voices for Health and Hope, and the Awake Project, Uniting Against the African AIDS Crisis. She holds a BA from Samford's, a Master's in Theological Studies from Vanderbilt Divinity School, as well as a PhD in History from Vanderbilt University. Responding to Ginny will be Ann Peterson. Ann is the Senior Vice President of Global Programs at Americares and oversees the organization's health programs for people afflicted by poverty or disaster. She previously worked at USAID's Global Health Bureau, the Ponce School of Medicine and Health Services in Puerto Rico, as well as George Washington University. She's worked as a consultant for the U.S. Centers of Disease Control and Prevention and worked in sub-Saharan Africa on community development, public health training, as well as AIDS prevention programs. She serves on a number of international boards, including the Global Fund, Stop TB, and the Child Survival Partnership, and earned her bachelor's degree in biological sciences from the University of Washington, her medical degree from Mayo Medical School, and her master's in public health and preventative medicine from Emory University. At the conclusion of Ginny's remarks, Ann will provide a response, and then Ginny, Ann, and I will have a moderated conversation, followed by the most dynamic part of the evening, questions from the audience. Ginny, welcome.
Good evening. Thank you, Cherie, for that introduction. I want to express my sincere appreciation to the Trinity Forum for hosting this significant series on faith and international development. It's an honor to be here to speak this evening. And special thanks to the New Venture Fund and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation for this opportunity. I am truly humbled to follow the collective genius of Mike Gerson, Stephen Ballman, Mark Lagan, and others. Each are colleagues, but also personal heroes of mine in global health and development. The theme for this series is faith and international development, and I like the word faith because unlike the word religion, it originates as a verb, the Greek verb pisteuo, meaning to believe, to trust, to have confidence. Faith often intertwines with religion, but sometimes it does not, yet it always breathes life and energy and reciprocity with its subject. And tonight the subject before us is international development. The Apostle Paul tells us in Romans that faith comes by hearing and hearing by the word of God. And in Hebrews, we read, faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the certainty of things unseen. And I want to talk about the role of the faith community with a focus on evangelicals in the U.S. in advancing global health at the turn of the millennium, and then discuss the role of evangelicals in the Trump era and what that means for foreign assistance today. So first, let me give you some background. In 2002, I found myself in the middle of things and in the center of a longer story of U.S. intervention for international health and development that began decades before, yet crystallizes with a strong acceleration in 1990 and hit its stride in the early years of the Bush administration and continues through today. That year, I left a job as an editor at Thomas Nelson Publishing Company, and I accepted an offer at Vanderbilt to study history and critical theories of religion for a doctorate. And I was especially interested in the psychology of evangelicals, particularly those among the growing megachurches in the U.S. South and California. And there I was asked to direct a conference, AIDS in Africa, Science and Religion. And as a native Nashvilleian, I recruited pastors and teachers and activists, and even Thomas Nelson to publish a book, The Awake Project, Uniting Against the African AIDS Pandemic. In doing so, I found myself swept up in a movement with an Irish rock star who was leading what was called the Heart of America tour, landing in Nashville on World AIDS Day, at Lowe's Hotel with a keynote speech between Senator Dr. Bill Frist and Bono. Both had contributed to the Awake Project, and both asked me to sit at their tables. When I first started talking with pastors from across Nashville in those early days about the African AIDS crisis, I will tell you that the stigma of HIV and AIDS was so great that only a small percentage were brave enough to be willing to get behind these critical issues. Sadly, I witnessed firsthand the racism, the blaming of sin, and the conscious self-alleviation of responsibility and the rationale of those who chose not to get involved. The next year, World Vision tested my qualitative anecdotal experience with a quantitative poll. And in 2003, they commissioned Barna to conduct a survey among evangelicals to ask if they would care for an AIDS orphan in Africa. Less than 3% said yes. Embarrassingly, just a few years later, that number had only risen to 14%. Yet miraculously, with Bono's Whirlwind Heart of America tour, phone calls and emails from across the heartland flooded the inboxes of congressmen in the White House at just the right moment. Bono's prophetic voice served as a catalyst, igniting a new conversation on how we can love our neighbors in many nations, albeit an ocean away, where 1 in 3 were threatened with a virus that would end their lives and the lives of their children if we did nothing. With the combined leadership of the Bush administration, the passion of Bono, the moral compass of Mike Gerson and Josh Bolton, Secretary Rice, Dr. Bill Frist, and the confession of Franklin Graham of Samaritan's Purse, admitting at his Prescription of Hope conference that the AIDS crisis was above and beyond all NGOs. The stars aligned for leadership for the greatest intervention of funding, as well as governmental partnerships and infrastructure for a single virus in history. In 2003, of course, President Bush made the official announcement at the State of the Union address to fund what was perhaps his greatest legacy, the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, or PEPFAR, with over $15 billion for the next 5 years. At that time, less than 50,000 people in sub-Saharan Africa had access to antiretroviral treatments. But today, thanks to the legislation of PEPFAR and the multilateral funding for the Global Fund to fight AIDS, TB, and malaria, more than 18 million people have access to ARVs, ending the hollowing out of civil societies across sub-Saharan Africa and around the world, thanks to American leadership. In his lecture a short while ago, Mike Gerson gave 5 points to defend the case for foreign aid. And I'm going to pick up on his point 3. That faith contributed to international development with what he called a movement of conscience. It was a diverse coalition encompassing progressives on the left and conservatives on the right, fostering unity across denominations and religions to fight extreme poverty and HIV, AIDS, and other global diseases. He calls this picture the opposite of the culture wars, whereby believers found common ground in the principles of human dignity and equality. And I found myself as the National Faith Outreach Director for Bono's organization, DATA, Debt, AIDS, Trade, Africa. We needed cultural influencers, leaders who are upstream of politics, to educate and activate the church to rethink this cagey virus and the lives of millions who hung in the balance. We crafted strategies to engage the church across the nation during the Bush administration. And Christian leaders such as Lynn and Bill Hybels, Kay and Rick Warren, Max Lucado, Amy Grant, Michael W. Smith, Rich Stearns, and many others joined the front lines of advocacy. They took a stand, and they offered their influential voices, wrote letters, flew to Washington, and educated their communities about HIV/AIDS crisis in Africa. A movement of conscience among pastors and leaders began to take hold. In those days, we did not have social networks. We did not have Facebook and Twitter, and we barely had a working website. Data did not have a snappy ring to it, and most people could barely remember we were not a tech company. And we would hand out postcards in church services and schools, and we would collect them, and we would enter them into a database. And we slowly built the first 1,000 and the second 1,000 and then 10,000 and 100,000 and beyond, one by one. And soon hearts began to soften and minds began to change. And the legislation of PEPFAR and the Global Fund and the Millennium Challenge Corporation and the President's Malaria Initiative began saving lives one by one. I don't think the power of the leadership in the faith-based coalition can be understated during these years. It took tremendous vision, courage, and the laying down of arms across the aisles to work together for our neighbors in Africa, the Caribbean, Southeast Asia, and Central America. And it took the humility of the church to admit that it would require the infrastructure of secular government to provide the kind of health care necessary to attend to the millions dying from infectious disease. But that is actually a biblical concept, noted in 1 Corinthians 1:28. But God chose the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, and God chose the weak things of the world to shame the strong. Now, 17 years later, as we stand here and look back at the unprecedented progress in public health that has saved the lives of millions, we recognize that it was the leadership and partnerships of governments which led this effort. Yet this effort wouldn't have existed without champions in the faith community, both in the U.S. and as implementers. Since 1990, thanks to the generosity of American tax dollars, the bipartisan courage of Congress, investments from other wealthy nations, philanthropy and implementation from FBOs, and the tremendous gifts by the private sector, our generation has led a historic, epic effort to have extreme poverty in the face of a growing population of those who live on $1.25 a day, from about 36% to 15% of the population. We've halved malarial deaths. We've halved tuberculosis deaths. We've halved maternal mortality. We've halved childhood deaths. And we have halved AIDS death since its peak in 2005. And we did all of this since 1990 with a tiny sliver of funding. 1% of the U.S. budget for foreign assistance, a penny to the dollar. Yet today, this 1% is at risk of being cut by 32%, as recommended by our current president. For the first time this century, we have the real possibility of slashing foreign assistance funding to levels that were held prior to the Reagan administration. So the question before us tonight is, how do we keep this momentum of faith, of the role of the faith community to propel, advocate, and implement hope among vulnerable populations worldwide? The Apostle James says in his epistle that our faith motivates us to love not just in word and deed, but in action and truth. Faith without deeds is dead. Tonight, I want to talk about hope for advancing global health and development with the leadership of the U.S. faith community. So today we find ourselves in a new administration and a new season. During the Obama administration, the faith community continued with a sustained voice to support the full funding of PEPFAR and other global disease as they had done in the past. This funding continued to increase, even if incrementally, enjoying bipartisan support in Congress and the executive branch. Yet the new Trump administration and its budget recommendations of draconian cuts to foreign assistance calls us to question, how now should the church respond? Do we need new strategies, fresh momentum, and new faith leaders at the table to advocate for the world's poorest? What is the role of the faith community in this environment? For the last 4 years, I've directed the faith-based Coalition for Healthy Mothers and Children Worldwide with support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And we have asked faith leaders across the nation to rethink the critical importance of healthy timing and spacing of pregnancies to save the lives of women and children. This is an effort to talk about the various interventions for maternal and child health, but one that allows us to take a deeper dive to discuss why access to contraceptives is so imperative for these young brides, these young mothers, many in their mid-teenage years, whose chance of surviving the complications of pregnancy and childbirth would be exponentially greater if they can just debut their first pregnancy after the age of 20. And if they can just space their children 3 years apart, their newborns are twice as likely to survive. It turns out family planning may be an access issue to create sustainability, alleviate extreme poverty, and create cultures of health in low-income nations. But to talk about international family planning is not an easy topic. When we launched a national survey just last year, we asked political religious conservatives what the first thing they thought of when they heard or read the words family planning. We overwhelmingly saw a one-word response: abortion. This language, this rhetoric, can be toxic among certain groups. But when we provided the utmost clarity in this survey about voluntary access to contraception as an option for couples, not including abortion, the vast majority both understood and either somewhat or strongly supported international family planning. The language was the key. Over the course of this year, we've had more new faith leaders sign our letters, make phone calls, and write emails and come to Washington than in any time I've experienced in the last 15 years. We've seen that leading evangelicals want to lend their voice and take a stand. 81% of white evangelicals may have voted for President Donald Trump, but I would wager that a vast number of leaders may not agree with his foreign assistance recommendations. Evangelicals care about saving the lives of mothers and children. They know if it's in our ability as a nation, it's simply the right thing to do. This past year, Hope Through Healing Hands conducted a second survey, national survey among conservatives to test the rhetoric, motivation, and understanding of global nutrition and food security. And when we asked them their top rationale for U.S. investment in global health and development, over 90% did not select moral and ethical responsibility, which is what I would have assumed, but they selected national security issues. And they are right. National security is an excellent rationale for investment in global health and development. Generals and admirals agree that without the soft power of development assistance, we will have to exponentially increase our military might, which is a critical leg of the stool, as it were, for defense and diplomacy. Where extreme poverty in nations is met with health care and humanitarian aid, the threat of terrorism can be greatly reduced. Former Senate Majority Leader Bill Frist, a doctor who has led surgeries in war-torn nations and has seen communities slowly build around health care, teaches us that health is a currency for peace. But the moral argument is a strong one, and so is the one to protect our public health, as well as the economic one. There are many good rationales, and I do see the faith community responding with a megaphone for the entire international affairs account, or the 150 account, for international family planning, for bilateral nutrition, for development assistance, for the Global Fund, and the list goes on. During the Bush administration, the church was duly educated on issues of global infectious disease and poverty, and I think we're seeing the continued fruit of that education today, as faith leaders lend their voice for those millions who still live on less than $1 a day. So I am optimistic. To date, Congress has eschewed the president's recommendations on foreign assistance, and it appears right now that the Senate has called for a 2 to 3% cut across the 150 account. While there really isn't any room for cuts for this minuscule account, we actually are thrilled that this is where things are, given our worry this past spring. Brené Brown, a professor and speaker, says hope is a function of struggle. Hope is not an emotion. Hope is a cognitive, behavioral process that we learn when we experience adversity. So if this is hope, I have hope for foreign assistance. I have hope in the face of the adversity of this season, and I am optimistic that the seeds of awareness and education and advocacy for the global health have been sown among leaders of faith over the last 20 years, and some of those seeds have fallen on fertile soil that will bring forth good fruit. Our members of Congress have held fast, and for that I am so grateful. I would like to close with an African proverb I heard recently from Congressman John Lewis, which says, "When you pray, move your feet." As Christians, we believe the church is the body of Christ, and we are the hands and feet, and we are the eyes and mouth. And we are called to faith and hope and love and prayer with action. And our prayer of action is living out the kingdom of God on earth as it is in heaven. It is transforming our minds and our communities to peace. And it is answering the drive of the scriptures to help the poor, to help those in need, to care for the widow and the orphan and the refugee. In Proverbs 31, King Lemuel's mother advises her son in his new position to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, for the rights of all who are destitute. Speak up and judge fairly. Defend the rights of the poor and needy. This is the simplest definition of advocacy. This should be our prayer in action. And in doing so, I think with God's help, we will advance hope, health, hope, healing, and peacemaking for both ourselves and the church, and to save the lives of millions we may never know around the world. Thank you.
So I want to add my thanks for the opportunity to be here tonight and really begin to grapple with these really huge issues. And I am going to concur a lot with my colleague, but I also want to go a little bit further. I began my career as a missionary in Africa. And I saw my first AIDS case in 1982 before it had a name, when one of my medical school colleagues was seeing the same kinds of patients in San Francisco. And I can remember working as a missionary doing community development. We've got to deal with this issue. We were seconded to an Anglican church who took on AIDS in the early 80s. But what was fascinating and troubling, and it's a long history of the church and the faith-based organization, is that bishop's very good response to AIDS is not necessarily the norm. The church and the faith-based organizations have been mixed in their responses to the key challenges in global health. So I can also remember missionary doctors who said, if I saw a car accident on the road, I know HIV is very high, I would not risk myself to stop and help that person because I don't want to risk getting it myself. And I'm thinking, how can a medical doctor, a Christian, a missionary not respond? But that's actually the dilemma we all have all the time, whether you're at the side of the road and seeing it personally, or whether you're hearing about it in the news and deciding, are you going to take action or not? And I'd like to talk a little bit both about the personal response as Christians, as well as the organizations that we work with and work through, as well as the call to action in advocacy. So we talked a little bit about HIV/AIDS. And family planning. And I will say that family planning, both of those, have been issues that have been very controversial for the faith community and within global health. When I was at USAID in 2002, and part of the US government that was trying to respond to HIV and build PEPFAR, there was a great debate about whether the faith-based organizations could or should be part of the response. Was this just a conservative agenda of the Bush administration to give money from the US government to faith groups, or was it in fact an absolutely essential part of our addressing what was becoming a global pandemic? And as a US government, and as an employee, and as a Christian, the answer for me was very simple. I had lived and worked for years in Africa. It was primarily an African epidemic. It was going to be impossible for any government, UN agency, WHO, or secular NGOs to address the AIDS epidemic if they did not include not only the faith-based organizations, but also the church leaders who were the trusted leaders within their communities. And so for me to be able, as a government employee, say, this is not about favoritism, this is about partnering with the right organizations who know and care about their communities, who are wanting to protect young girls, women, and children who are at risk. And if they do it well, and they receive funding from the US government, they will have results. And even if the administration changes, then they will have shown that they could deliver on results. This isn't favoritism. So this was reassuring to the faith community, but also a challenge to them. Many of the faith-based organizations have for a long time, and I've been part of faith-based organizations like World Vision as well, done really good work with great heart, have gone to the farthest reaches, hardest places in the world, and done what they thought was best. not necessarily measuring what was the outcomes of that. When you work for the U.S. government, when you receive funds from the U.S. government, you have to show that there are results from what you have done. And so one of the legacies that I think is probably the biggest legacy from that Bush administration and PEPFAR is the place where the faith-based organizations came together with a results orientation and not only showed that they were essential to responding to a global pandemic, but that they delivered the results. And they built their own rigor in measurement and proved that they were the go-to group. So when the administration changed, the faith-based organizations did not really lose their funding at that point in time. So that's a lesson for us as faith leaders working within organizations. I'm now in a secular organization as a person of faith. And my boss is a Christian, and some of my staff are a Christian. That's another sort of dynamic on Christians and leaders. Tony Hall, who was speaking a couple of weeks ago here, told one of the stories that I probably will remember forever, and that is as a U.S. government political appointee, he had someone, a good friend, come and say, my career from now on is to walk beside you in your life and be your prayer partner. When I was a missionary in Africa, I had prayer partners. I had hundreds of prayer partners. People prayed for me every day. When I was a political appointee in the U.S. government, suddenly I was that government thing, that government entity, and finding those people who would pray alongside of me during that most critical period of time was much harder. You know, I work for the government, I'm your friend. Yeah, do we really believe that? And yet, I had more opportunities to do good when I was within government than when I was working in a little tiny community. And so at least one of the messages I would like to add to the discussion is wherever we are, whatever we are doing, whether you are in a government agency or in a secular organization, or you're in a faith-based organization, you have the opportunity to pull together and to pray for one another and lift one another up. And too often, we only do it for those who have the label of being a faith-based organization or a Christian in a direct ministry. And some of the best Christian efforts that are going on are being done behind the scenes by people who are living out their hearts and their faith through other secular organizations. I will also say that working within a government organization and addressing really hard issues, speaking for the role of faith-based organizations within the government is a wearying role, especially if you don't have the faith support. And so it's something that we should think about, who is it that you know now within a new administration? And I can promise you there are many Christians that are within the Trump administration who need your support, prayer, guidance, so that they can, in fact, work through the administration to achieve the best health options, the best funding that we can get for the issues that many of us care so much about. I would also say we're still in a place where the faith community is a little mixed. In Ebola, and I went to Liberia and Sierra Leone during the height of the Ebola crisis, we again had a very mixed faith response. We had some great churches and some great faith-based organizations who stepped up to the plate and really cared for those people who were in dire straits. And we had others who, like with the HIV/AIDS epidemic, were hands off, this must be their fault, and a very bad response. We need to take those lessons to heart and think about what are the next crisis where we as people of faith and our faith-based organizations and the governments that represent us, are we responding correctly with love and care and compassion and unifying the faith community to support. And I will tell you, as an organization, now secular organization, responding to disaster and doing global health, I can barely fundraise against the Syrian refugee crisis or the Rohingya crisis in Bangladesh, which are headed towards genocide. How is this not an issue that the church should be standing up and dealing with? And so I will challenge all of you not just to think back to what happened with the AIDS, which we did well and not so well, or Ebola that we did well and not so well, but going forward, those people who live in conflict zones, political crises that are not of their own making for the most part. And I think the U.S. is beginning to see that you can have leaders and political crisis that you didn't anticipate in your own government, right? So there are many people in many places who live under governments that they're not very happy with, and it's very dangerous. And we should be looking at how do we respond as a church, as an individual Christian, and as faith organizations together on these issues going forward. And I think I will stop at that and go to some discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you both for those remarks. And I figured just to start off the questions, we'd start at the very beginning, which is one of the questions that always comes up is how to prioritize the needs of one's neighbors. And that need can seem limitless. You mentioned the Rohingya, the many needs worldwide. Why should people of faith prioritize needs in developing countries when there are so many unmet needs at home, including in the areas of health, prevention, and wellness?
You want me to start?
Sure.
I mean, I think the answer is always both and, right? I mean, I think we have to address the needs of our neighbors at home, locally, and I think, but I think it's also incumbent especially in an increasingly globalized community, to address the needs of vulnerable populations, the world's poorest, particularly around the world as well. How to do that, how to prioritize is difficult. Over 50% of Americans believe that our U.S. budget, our foreign assistance, is about 28% of the U.S. budget, and it's really just less than 1%. I mean, if you look at global health and development, it's less than 2/3 of 1%. It's just a fraction. And I think that's an important thing to remember when we're thinking about addressing these needs. We're not talking about vast amounts, a percentage of the budget. We're talking about less than 1% in addressing these very important needs for millions of people.
Mm-hmm. So I guess I would start from, but for the chance of birth, their story could be our story. My youngest child was born in Africa. My kids grew up there. Their best friends lived the experience of Africans. And it becomes much clearer that we have been incredibly blessed, protected, and maybe that won't happen forever. 9/11 was a wake-up call that violence could happen in our own country. So I think that recognizing that we are called to love ourselves as our neighbors as ourselves, well, our neighbors across the world could really be us. And so for me, when I go to another country, another place, and see the needs, one, it's much more spectacular depth of need than most Americans experience. Mm-hmm. But it could be where my children had grown up and lived. The other thing that, without trying to push something that I feel very strongly about, the international development, we should be getting out there and doing much more. We should be spending 28%. No. If we got the 5, I'd probably be brilliantly happy. But it's a calling, and there are people who are called to take care of the neighbors here at home. The homeless, there is trafficking in this part of the country. There are needs everywhere. There is raising your children well. It's recognizing that God has a calling for everyone. My calling is to go to bad parts of the world and try and help people live better. I do wonder how there can be so much need in other parts of the world and so few other people who seem to have been called to go there, and whether the Christians in the U.S. have all listened to, heard, and followed their call, or I would have expected more to be there. So I just came back from Puerto Rico, and I used to work there, and it was really remarkable to me how few NGOs were responding. It was mainly the Puerto Ricans themselves taking care of themselves, gathering together and responding. Our organization was one of the few, and now the federal government has come in. And that's sort of what it feels like in the global health arena. The needs are huge. Those who are responding, the workers for the harvest, are few. And I think the harvest includes caring and compassion for the people of the world.
You both spoke extensively about and really played a large role in the remarkable case of AIDS reduction, and how largely it was faith-based groups and perhaps particularly evangelicals who at the outset seemed, if anything, oppositional, even hostile to intervention, but whose involvement and support was absolutely pivotal to it happening. First of all, how did that happen? What were the key points that enabled public opinion within faith-based communities to swing so dramatically? And secondly, are there other issues in global health that could really be comparable to the AIDS issue, where a greater involvement of the faith-based community could result in, say, the reduction by half of the deaths?
Yeah, I'll start. I think it was the role of faith leaders. There were some key faith leaders in the early part of the 2000s that really took a stand, and they were known nationally. So I really think Rick and Kay Warren picking up global AIDS was a huge thing with their HIV/AIDS conference at Saddleback in 2005. Bill and Lynn Hybels were early on supporters in 2002 and really energized and educated their entire Willow Creek community about HIV/AIDS. There was a meeting at Charlie Peacock's house. I don't know if you guys know who he is, but he's from Nashville and I'm from Nashville. And he's a recording artist and kind of a father of Christian music, if you will, and had 40 Christian music artists at his home, leading artists who all got to meet with Bono and hear the story. And of course, many had been to Africa and seen some of this. I think it took leadership from Franklin Graham and some of the leading FBOs who were in Africa to come back and tell the stories. I know Senator Frist had spent 20 years going and doing these surgeries, and he would take photos and lay them on the desk of President Bush and say, look, this virus is really hollowing out societies, and we have to do something about it. I think it came from various corners, but it came from top-level leadership. And that's how we saw kind of a move in that direction in those early years. As a second issue, I have been working around family planning for 4 to 5 years now, and I do find it a very central issue. If we can tackle issues around family planning and population growth, and I hesitate to say that because I don't want to quite go there, but if you can allow the mom to go back to work and she just has 2 kids and not 6 to feed, you are addressing so many different sustainable development goals. You're addressing hunger, you're addressing education, she can stay in school, our children can stay in school. You're addressing the prevention of mother and child transmission of HIV/AIDS, maternal mortality, infant mortality, and childhood issues. The list goes on. It will never enjoy the funding that PEPFAR and even the Global Fund probably has had, but it is a critical intervention amongst a variety of interventions for global health.
I'd go back to the fact that it was a mixed response from the faith community early on. There were churches and FBOs that were working on the AIDS epidemic from the mid-'80s on. And then there were some that were vocally hostile. But it was very mixed, some very adamant. And I think what changed with the Bush administration was the unifying of the faith voice that were already working in it and saying it's important. And it wasn't just one person, it was each of the groups coming together. And certainly somebody like Rick and Kay taking it on made a really big difference. But I think the voices were there and it was pulling them all together and giving it a very strong voice, saying, yes, this is a controversial disease, but look at what it is doing to Africa, look who it, and that was a critical factor as well, the difference in the demographics in Africa. But it brought people together and a stronger voice, and then it became more reasoned. And we were able to make the case we could do something about it and that the church could do it. I'm chairman of the board of Christian Connections for International Health, which has taken on the family planning issue as a very strong advocacy issue because, as you pointed out, there have been a lot of misconceptions about family planning. I will, from my database perspective, say family planning is probably one of the most cost-effective interventions for saving lives, both mortality and morbidity, coming right after immunization. People don't realize that. And so, again, on a controversial issue, if you can get multiple faith voices coming together and saying, this is important, this is about moms living, this is about babies being born healthy and being able to grow forward. I will tell you that there's an issue that I'm hoping the church can take up, and that is mental health. Mental health, psychosocial, emotional resiliency. And again, Rick and Kay Warren are leading the way on that, and I think we've got a strong voice. It's always been there as an issue. We didn't really own it within the health community for a long time because we were so busy stopping deaths, we didn't think about emotional health. And now we are starting to realize that, one, there are deaths, but two, emotional health is part of all of our health. And with the number of wars and disasters and refugees and military personnel, the scope of the need is huge. So this is a place where the faith community could be the front runners in beginning to address something that is at escalating and epidemic proportions.
One of the things that faith-based global health groups are often criticized for is that they come with a point of view, which they unabashedly do. Many of them, the folks there, are motivated by love of God as well as love of neighbor and see their work as acting out and embodying that mission. At the same time that faith-based groups are criticized for that, providing health care service of any kind in a desperately needy area can be seen as a sort of soft power. It's not without its own power dynamics. Is it, one, possible to be neutral in such circumstances? And secondly, given your own experience, how did you navigate the criticisms or suspicions that others might have?
So I spent a lot of time in Afghanistan, and that is a place where this issue comes up all the time, not just about providing health, but any kind of development portfolio. Are you doing it from a focus of manipulation, the soft power? You're trying to get somebody to do something that is not for its own merits. As a health professional, when someone is either sick or suffering, or more from a public health perspective, I know I can prevent them from being sick and suffering. That God-given compulsion to make a difference is really, really important. So I feel like I am neutral. I will give it to whoever is in need, whatever side of whatever political controversies. But I can remember when I was still within my US government post going to Afghanistan, we visited a little clinic in the western area near Herat, and we're talking to the head of the Shura, So I was in a room with all Muslim men, probably some of them Taliban, wearing my headscarf. And I said, why are you excited about this US government-funded clinic? And they said, my women no longer die in childbirth. My children are staying healthy. This is the peace dividend. If we can keep peace, then we will continue to get this health care, and that's what I want for my family. So I don't feel like there's a conflict of interest in showing compassion and care and bringing health to populations across the world. And I will be unabashed about doing it.
I would keep my answers brief compared to her experiences, but I was thinking of Mark Ligon's speech a couple of weeks back around human dignity and flourishing, that we're all a part, we all carry the Imago Dei, and that's truly how I think about everyone around the world. I work with a pastor in Nashville. His name's Mike Glenn of Brentwood Baptist Church, and he had this beautiful statement to say that as all members as Imago Deis, we make up a mosaic, a beautiful mosaic of the children of God, and I think about that. I think we're all deserving of care and compassion and access to health care.
So faith-based organizations have gone places that nation states haven't gone, that secular NGOs haven't gone, into some of the most difficult to reach places to minister to the most vulnerable people. At the same time, they're also often constrained by resources, lack of funding, lack of other resources. When is it desirable to partner with other NGOs or with nations, and how have you navigated that?
That's a good question for you.
So most of the problems that we face now internationally, I think, are too big to ever do it by yourself. They're complex. You know, even the health issues that I think about, we're past the day where you're just going to go and vaccinate. If you want to deal with having a healthy child, you need to be talking about their nutrition. That means you need to be talking to the agriculture people about food productivity. So we should be talking to other people and partnering in general. And there are going to be secular organizations and governments that are going to be the best partners who do it well. So I am quite content to partner. There are governments that sometimes are going to be a little more dicey, where in association you could be seen as condoning a political situation. You have to walk through that more carefully. The one that comes up more often for an FBO organization and some NGOs is working, say, with the corporate sector for business enterprises. And I can remember when we started the Global Alliance for Improved Nutrition, GAIN, it was, should Kraft Foods be allowed to be part of this, because they make money off of selling food that people didn't think was appropriate, but they wanted to be involved in improved nutrition. You know, you could, expand that. We work often with the pharmaceutical sector, who both make money off of selling drugs, but they also contribute drugs and supplies across the world to people in need. So it can be a little thought-provoking, but it is quite possible.
Anything to add, Jenny? All right. Well, we'll turn to the most dynamic and often the most interesting part of an evening conversation, which is where we hear from you all. And those of you who have been to a Trinity Forum event before know that we have just 3 guidelines for questions, that all questions should be brief, should be civil, and all questions should be in the form of a question. We have 2 folks with microphones. Please wait for you to be called on. In fact, I'm going to stand up so I can see people a little bit more easily here, and then just speak into the microphone. So questions for our speaker and respondent from the audience. Mark Lagon, right here in the front row.
Thank you both for your thought-provoking remarks in this dialogue. Jenny, I have a question for you that might kind of reverse some of the the focus of your remarks, in some ways you were looking at how can we break through a moment in which people don't understand the importance of fighting for global health, or that there's kind of a bargain in development assistance. It seems like there's potential for revivifying a sense of internationalism and for maybe reaching across, different groups in the aisle on global health. There's some, funding lines that may be under threat, but do you think there's a way in which the health issue can contribute to the health of our own political culture? Is there a way that there can be a spreading out from that to be something larger? And what's the role of the faith community in that?
Oh, that's a great question. I think so. I mean, Senator Frust and Senator Kerry wrote really the precursor to what is PEPFAR back in 2001, I think. These issues have enjoyed across the aisle, from Democrats to Republicans, a unified front. And that has been amazing to watch, that we can agree that this 2/3 of 1% of the U.S. budget should go towards foreign assistance. We should be a country that is benevolent and help save the lives of millions if we can. And we've done so. And I do think today it is a great moment for unity. It's a great space where we can come across the political divide, across the polemics, and agree to care about the world's poorest. When we were doing this survey, Americans, when we were testing whether they could connect U.S. branding with providing foreign assistance, with the investment of funding for global nutrition, there wasn't the connect, but it is so, and Anne, I'm sure, could speak to this, but it's a wonderful thing to be able to give to people in need around the world in low-income nations, and I think it's something we all reap the benefits of, and I think it is a moment we could all come together on.
Certainly my experience within the U.S. government and going to Congress for funding was that they were pretty unified on global health. Moms and kids and keeping them healthy is a good issue for Congress and congressional support. It was hard to get it to expand to other areas of development, so using it as a hook was more difficult. But I think one of the big lessons that started with AIDS, with actually a little bit before that with West Nile, is what happens in the rest of the world doesn't just stay there. So infectious diseases are obvious. They start in one place and they can cross the world. Flu crosses the world every year. But other issues also cross the world every year. And I think there is an opportunity to say, not only do we care about the rest of the world, but what happens to them makes a difference here at home as well. And even for those who are more focused on themselves, that they need to understand what's happening and care about it, because it eventually will come home to them. And that's one way to get the bipartisan support. It helps if you can be clear, you have interventions you can prove that work, and that they don't cost too much. And that last part is the really hard part.
Other questions from the audience? Right there.
Thank you. You were talking about how you think that mental and emotional issues are a rising priority. I'm curious, if you talk about faith-based organizations, and you have a Christian doctor giving out penicillin versus an atheist, let's just say, doctor giving out penicillin. Well, hopefully, the penicillin that's given out is going to address a problem. Obviously, people might be suspicious of motives and these kind of things and that sort of thing. But when you get into the emotional and mental health area, in a certain sense, it could be that, at least in many cases, the faith component is the penicillin, right? It's the key piece. At least I would certainly say that in dealing with people with affective disorders as a pastor. If I were told, it's not that I couldn't help in some way, but if I were told I had to suppress any faith component to what I was doing to address that, I would feel like I had to leave the big guns in the back room. So I'm curious as to how you might look at that potential problem.
So, thank you. I think in the mental health and emotional health, the faith community has, we're several steps ahead. In many parts of the world, your physical health has never been seen as separate from your emotional or your spiritual health, and they see life and people as a whole. And Christians who are responding to health needs from a Christian perspective and from a spiritual perspective are already in that mindset of understanding if you're sick, you can feel really bad about yourself. If you feel really bad about yourself, you may start having difficulty in relationships and lose faith in God, and all of those things are intertwined. So I think the faith community is particularly well placed to reach out and begin to address those issues. There is still role for biochemical responses and the penicillins, but that we should and can be responding to people with the compassion and care that comes from our Christian perspective. I think that is also something that Christian providers have a tendency to do a little better, not always. I don't want to overstate it, but the community health workers that you train who are volunteers for decades after decades, we certainly have experienced that if they're doing it from a faith perspective, they tend to do it with more compassion for longer because they feel it is a calling of God to care for their neighbors. So there's that element as well that comes from the faith community in dealing with any health issues, but especially from the mental health and emotional health issues.
Other questions? Right here.
Hi. I spent my first few years in DC working for an international human rights nonprofit that focused on women's rights, and the very kind of conservative Christian environment I came from were kind of shocked and horrified by that. They associated dramatic things with it. You kind of talked about that in the poll earlier. And now I do domestic health care, and the correlation between the two has become very interesting to me. And the family planning stuff you've been mentioning really caught my attention. So it seems almost like a reach to hope or expect that we will have support for international family planning when that's kind of been so controversial and even threatened here domestically. So I'm just curious to see, do you see a connection between those two? What role can the church be playing to kind of address these very important life-affecting issues from a compassionate way that kind of can help draw in broader Christian communities and just kind of educate here at home? And just what are your thoughts about that?
Sure. Well, they're two very different accounts, right? So international family planning falls in the global health account. And that is the area in which I work. I don't work with domestic health care as it pertains to family planning. I mean, when we're talking about women who live on less than $1 a day, on $2 a day, who do not even have access, for the most part, to health care, they're questioning where their next meal is from. It is, in my mind, a different, it can be a different situation. It not always is, but it can be. To be living with extreme poverty and facing, an early debut of a pregnancy where, in Ethiopia, the average age of marriage is 16. These are life and death issues for women in extreme poverty. 1 in 30 women in sub-Saharan Africa die in childbirth or from pregnancy. I mean, it is a life-saving mechanism. I mean, Anne said that earlier in her mind. And I think that's a crucial story to tell the church. And in fact, we did do a book, Cherie mentioned it earlier, the Mother and Child Project, and Kay Warren wrote the foreword, and Melinda Gates wrote a preface. And we have 47 different evangelicals who contributed to the book, all around healthy timing and spacing of pregnancies, to talk about it from a variety of different angles and why it's of critical importance for women and children in the developing world. Just so you know, International Family Planning this year actually held the line of funding to the same level of funding as it has the year before and the year before that and the year before that. It has been a stable level of funding. We were excited to see that and enjoyed that continued support across Congress this year.
So I also did a fair amount of domestic. I was Commissioner of Health for the state of Virginia, so in charge of family planning programs here in the U.S. And I was very struck as I had left Africa and suddenly was in the policy arena in the U.S., how many similarities there are. While it is really dramatic in the international setting, both the benefits and results of family planning, it is the same kinds of issues in the U.S. We're looking at teen pregnancy rates that are not good for the children, not good for the mothers. It isn't as dramatic life and death, but it is the same kinds of issues. And I think the hesitation to be involved in family planning domestically is the same, coming from the same cause, and that is a fear that it is promoting abortion. And while in the international setting, it's are you funding mechanisms of family planning that some Christians would consider abortifacients? And we did a lot of talking about mechanisms of action and discovering that, in fact, most of the family planning are truly contraceptive. The problem on the US side is that the organizations who provide family planning services often also provide abortion services. And so you suddenly have a cost-effective, vitally needed intervention that's mixed up in something that this country, and especially people of faith, feel very strongly about and is very controversial. So I've spent a lot of time trying to separate the two. So we're never, I don't think, going to get Americans in one place on abortion. But I would hope and dream that we can get Americans in the same place on family planning, in being able to prevent teen pregnancies and make sure every mother has a healthy pregnancy and every baby is born healthy. And that's the same domestically as internationally.
All right, we will take just 2 more questions. One, Jeff, and then we'll end over here.
I have a question. In terms of the faith-based, I hear a lot of helping, how we should help because we should help. But where is the line, particularly when you get involved with a government, of when you're restricted or you're not able to share with your underlying faith? That if I'm helping simply because it's a good thing to do and there's poor people in the world, that's maybe a role for the U.S. government. But in terms of a faith-based organization, if I have an intention to get the gospel message out, for example, can you do that? Are you allowed to do that? Where is the line between we're a secular governmental organization and we're a faith-based organization, not only wants to help, but we want to tell you why we're helping, and the helping is the gospel?
So I'll do it first for the government perspective. If a faith-based organization gets money from the US government, they may not evangelize. They can do humanitarian work that is even-handed. So that part is pretty clear. It's in the legal guidelines. I personally feel very comfortable that when I am living out what Jesus modeled in caring and being compassionate, I don't necessarily have to say, this is why I am doing it. But I will tell you that in Muslim countries where I have worked, and I have worked without verbalizing, I am a Christian, I am doing this because I am a Christian, would you like to hear about it? I very often will get that question eventually. You build, you're being compassionate, you're living it out, you show you care, And they're very open about their faith. They'll start asking you questions. What does this mean to you? You know, how are relationships and children? And I have been asked more interesting questions in countries where I never thought I would be allowed to speak about why. But it wasn't me pushing it and proselytizing. It was in response to relationships and the compassion that I exhibited. I know others who have worked for 15 or 20 years doing compassionate work before they had the opportunity to have those conversations. But I think you can do it, and that it is appropriate.
I would like to add that you could, you know, as a person, as a lay person, as a citizen, that you should do both. I mean, support a child at Compassion International, support a faith-based organization, but also do the advocacy with your local congressional leader to advance global health with funding from our U.S. government as well. That the two shouldn't be mutually exclusive. The two should go hand in hand.
If I could add something, one of my most interesting experience representing the U.S. government in some international forum, and especially during the Bush administration, where not all of our international colleagues were thrilled with our U.S. government, and we've been there before and there again. What was fascinating to me is PEPFAR got started under the Bush administration, Global Fund got started under the Bush administration. Our international colleagues didn't necessarily like our president, but when we stepped up to the plate and did the right thing as the US government, they followed us. So that is a really strong argument for not only having the faith community support their own action in global health or international development, but for the faith community to support our government stepping up and representing us as compassionate Americans and leading the way across the world, because then the rest of the world does follow the American example, even when they don't like us. It's very awkward and uncomfortable, but it was really nice to see.
Last question, first row here.
Thank you. That was a great segue, because I was going to ask about the relationship between the faith communities in the United States and in other regions, Europe, for example. Is there a platform where everyone gets together and where they can help us get through some troubled times?
What a lovely question. Thank you. So Christian Connections for International Health grew out of the global health NGO communities that all gathered together, and then realized that there were a lot of Christian organizations that very specifically wanted to talk about their struggles, the faith voice, and coming together. So it is a networking organization. It has US-based, faith-based organizations, you know, the World Visions and you know, a lot of them, and it has church hospital associations from across Africa, some from Asia, and they gather together, learn from one another. They do technical talks on best practices in global health, but then one of the main pillars is on integration of faith in health. How do you do it when you are a Christian hospital in Pakistan, and also, you know, share the ideas of health system strengthening from a faith perspective in Zaire, in DRC. So there is a platform. It is a growing platform. It includes American NGOs and individual Christians and faith organizations, especially the church hospitals across Africa and the world.
Anything to add, Jenny?
No, it's a lovely organization. We've been working with them for several years. So.
Okay. Lovely question, lovely organization. Jenny and Ann, thank you very much. It's now my somewhat awkward pleasure to ask you to turn your attention from the large questions of global health and development to the small invitation that should have been on each of your chairs, which is to join the Trinity Forum Society. We hope that you will avail yourself of this invitation. A part of what we try to do, you've seen tonight, which is to provide a platform and a space for leaders to grapple with those big questions in a setting that is both civil and hospitable while maintaining intellectual rigor. There are not many spaces like that. We think the need is particularly acute, perhaps even desperate in times of growing trivialization, polarization, and downright unpleasantness. We try to provide a space to talk about what matters most in a civil, intellectually rigorous, faith-drenched, and warmly hospitable way. All members of the Trinity Forum Society get several benefits, including our quarterly readings where we take the best of literature and letters, explain why it is important to read, add an introduction at the beginning explaining significance, context, and relevance, add discussion questions in the back, so it is essentially a book club in a bag, as well as our monthly podcast series with thought leaders and our daily list of curated readings entitled What We're Reading. As a special incentive to join, if you join tonight, the first 10 people will get a free copy of our newest reading, selections from Ellen Johnson Sirleaf's This Child Will Be Great, which we commend to you, a fascinating story of a really remarkable woman and one whose faith, her leadership, her dedication to others all combine into a really remarkable story. So we commend that to you and hope you'll avail yourself of that invitation. In addition, we'll be posting video from tonight within the next 48 hours. Please feel free to share that with others, as well as photographs on our Facebook page, so tag others and share. Also wanted to let you know about upcoming events. We've had a remarkably busy fall, and there's more to come. So in just a couple of weeks, we will be hosting Os Guinness, our founder, and a well-known sociologist who will be speaking on the eve of the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, about its consequences, its implications, and its influence. We'll be speaking at the Army. He'll be speaking at the Army-Navy Club, and encourage you to join us for that. In this very room, in 3 weeks, on November 8th, we'll be hosting Stanford neuroscientist Bill Newsome to talk about mind, matter, and our maker, what neuroscience has to tell us about faith. It'll be a fascinating conversation in this very room. We hope you will join us again for that. And finally, the 5th part of our 5-part series on faith and international development will also be in this room on January 17th. So mark your calendars now. We'll be hosting World Vision CEO Rick Stearns, along with Opportunity International CEO Peter Greer, to talk about holistic poverty alleviation. It'll be a fascinating conversation, and really hope that you can join us. Finally, as we always do, we will end with thanks. There are many people to thank who made this evening possible, and it's always a pleasure to do so. We should start off by thanking our sponsors, the New Venture Fund and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, that made this evening possible. Our fantastic volunteers, Hannah Wolf and Esther Holm, who gave up their evening to help us out. Clay Blackmore, our skilled photographer. My fantastic colleagues who do so much behind the scenes to make this evening go smoothly. Colleen O'Malley, Alyssa Abraham, Ashley White Brothers, and intern extraordinaire Rebecca Noyes. Thanks again to our speakers, Jenny Dyer and Ann Peterson, as well as to all of you for coming, and good night.